Welcome back. Now, United States President Donald Trump delivered his much-anticipated speech to the country's joint session of Congress in Washington a while ago. And as I say, a while ago, that was earlier this morning. Now, this was his first major speech since his return to office 6 weeks ago for his second term as U.S. president. Trump has made global headlines, and his stance on America's trade and foreign relations have also raised many eyebrows. South Africa has not been spared either, with Trump suspending much-needed aid funding and accusing the country of serious human rights violations and taking positions against the United States and its allies. Now, to talk to us about these developments and much more that's come out of the second Trump presidency, we joined this morning by Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, and he's risk analyst and a former diplomat, as well as Doctor Azar Jammine, who is Director and Chief Economist at Econometrix. Gentlemen, good morning to both of you, and thank you so much for joining us here on Morning Live. And Dr. Makhubela, if I could start with you. Firstly, what have you made of Donald Trump and his second term of office? Because for all intents and purposes, Donald Trump has just thrown out the playbook, and he is doing what Donald Trump wants to do, it would seem.
Good morning, Sakina. Absolutely. There are two areas that one would like to touch now. He's much more domestic. He dealt with his campaign issues, draining the swamp. What was quite astonishing is the revelation about the age group within the social security system, that you have people who are 300 years who are still getting benefits from the social security system. People in their hundreds of years, and these are millions of people. So there's something wrong with the system. And looking at what he was saying, I asked myself, how is a risk for the South African social security services? That's one area that Donald Trump dealt with. But Donald Trump did not deal with concerns from members of NATO. There's no reference to NATO throughout the speech, even though this matter has occupied leaders across the Atlantic. There's no reference to NATO. And he's just issued out instructions yesterday that Washington should not, Britain should not share military intelligence with Ukraine. He read the Ukrainian letter, reiterated the letter from President Zelensky, reiterated his commitment that there's a possibility of a deal with Putin, and he has confidence in Putin. But other than that, the multilateralism issues are out. I mean, he spoke about the withdrawal from the World Health Organization, the question of the UN human rights body, and the climate change process. So he's moving away from multilateralism. No mention of other institutions of multilateral, no confidence in terms of the relations with his allies across the Atlantic. So those are clearly things that are not visible in his statement, but much more focused on the domestic front. Let me tell you what I think, Sakina, in short, what is the biggest challenge and risk that I see for South Africa. He spoke about their farmers, that they would not compete with foreign produce in their markets. South Africa will be affected. He's going to introduce this tariffs on the 2nd of April, so that's going to hit us. So what people have been campaigning here, particularly the AfriForum and so on, is going to hit farmers, their biggest constituency, quite clearly. It's not targeted South Africa, but it's targeting every farmer, given the fact that China has imposed serious restriction on the agricultural produce to China. So they're going to look for a market. And looking for that market, they are looking for this reciprocity.
And speaking about that, you know, he went on about tariffs. He's vowed, you know, there would be more tariffs to other countries, reciprocal, he calls it, and talking about how the United States has been unfairly treated in this regard, even by people whom they consider to be their friends. He singles out, for example, South Korea during his speech for that. But then he also talks about cutting tax. And this, of course, has some in the United States government worried about a growing debt burden for that country. What did you make of that, Dr. Makhubela?
You know, the tax benefits will, of course, always go to big companies, and they have been his main supporters. There are no specifics in terms of how he's going to distribute the tax benefits, but the big tech are likely to benefit from this. You would have seen, Sakina, the offensive they've taken, even during the meeting with Stammer. You remember JD told Stammer about how they're going to protect their high tech and the freedom of speech. So that's going to happen. But this is the economy that is not doing well. There are expectations now or suggestion that the economy may contract, and the debt, it's running at 36 trillion. How is going to fund this thing without raising taxes and taxing the rich? So the rich are going to benefit here. So the big problem, again, you remember, Sakina, there's been a discussion in Brazil to tax the top 9 wealthy people to fund some of this project within the G20 framework. It's not going to happen. South Africa intended to move on with that initiative from Brazil. It's not going to happen. So the big company will definitely be protected by Trump.
So the speech was themed the renewal of the American dream. And how do you see this American dream, Dr. Makhubela, especially for Americans, given what Donald Trump had to say? He's totally unambiguous about his stance on various matters. And I suppose one could say that is a plus, you know, where the president is just so blunt about his stance. You don't have to question, you don't have to think about it. It is clear where he stands on the gender issue. It is clear where he stands on the matters we've just discussed on taxation, on tariffs, the geopolitical issues as well, which seems to have thrown the world into disarray given what the stance was. You spoke about NATO and what the stance was with America and NATO before Trump, and how that has just been turned on its head right now. Trump speaking to Putin, talking about getting Putin to speak to Iran and lead those discussions. And, you know, it's just thrown everyone out, and the whole thing is on its head right now.
Let me tell you, this is the disruptive Trump. And one thing I think that NATO, wherever they are, very concerned. That's why you've seen Mark Rutte, even during the weekend, urging Zelensky to reach some level of reconciliation with Donald Trump. Because the Americans are putting close to 400 billion within the NATO system. So they are unwilling to continue to put this amount of money. So that's where one big challenge is. But, you know, Sakina, this disruptiveness of Trump may work very well, because there's a need really to relook at the security architecture of Europe, not only Europe, of the entire world. Because NATO, it's an institution that was developed during the Cold War to deal with Cold War related matters. It hasn't changed the mentality. That's why NATO has to find an enemy. NATO can't function without an enemy. There must be an enemy. And that's why they're constantly looking for enemies and creating enemies around the world. That's where the big challenge is.
And I must say, I couldn't agree with you more on that, Dr. Makhubela, because whether you agree with Trump or not, the one thing is that this disruption that he has brought about is giving the world opportunity to perhaps reset on some of these matters. The United Nations and its Security Council, for example, something that people have been talking about. African nations, as an example, have been agitating for at least 2 seats on that Security Council, permanent seats. And maybe this second coming of Trump will give more impetus to some of these talks.
Trump is a big power mentality person. There's no way he would give veto power to medium-sized countries like South Africa, Egypt, or Nigeria. That is not going to happen. They may allow seats within the Security Council, but veto power, he would not give it there. I mean, look at our economy, less than close to 400 billion US dollars, and to go and really punch with countries that are in their trillion. Trump is not going to do that. That's one. The other thing, Sakina, Trump is not going to allow small countries to have as they wish and have veto powers over everything. That's why the world will go back to Trump to go back to the World Health Organization, even to the Human Rights Organization within the UN system. So he's not going to allow the Security Council to have more powers than his sovereign power. Remember, this is a man who's endowed with the Caesarean powers, too much power concentrated on his hands, and he's been using this power. He's been using the presidential decrees literally to rule. He's had only one cabinet meeting, but everything else has been done through his executive orders.
And who knows, perhaps an opportunity to reset in terms of other powers in the world, maybe moving closer towards each other, maybe in response to what Donald Trump is doing. But Dr. Azar Jammine is also with us. And Dr. Jammine, within his first 6 weeks in office, we saw Trump managing to make daily headlines, as Dr. Makhubela just said, ruling there through those executive orders. And, you know, he's making news globally, the latest being the trade wars in the tariffs against China, Canada, Mexico. He spoke there in his speech about how Honda have now moved their plant to Indiana, and this is obviously going to benefit Americans. But how much has he said in his speech that will actually hurt our trade relations with the United States as South Africa?
There are a number of ways in which our trade relations could be hurt. Obviously, if he basically gets rid of AGOA or South Africa's access to AGOA, then a small proportion of our trade relations will be affected, especially in respect of automobiles and wines and a couple of fruits. But one has to realize that South Africa's trade with the United States is relatively small in relation with South Africa's trade with Europe and East Asia, especially China. And so one shouldn't overstate the impact of the abrogation of AGOA for South Africa. But it's the indirect effects that concern one, in that the tariffs, if you keep getting the retaliatory measures being taken of the kind that we've been hearing over the last 24 hours, you could see a sharp downturn in U.S. economic growth and in global economic growth, and that could depress the demand for all South Africa's exports, especially commodities. And it's that indirect manner in which this could affect South Africa negatively.
So as South Africa, what do we have that we could perhaps push back against the United States and Trump with at this point? Because you take Canada, they announced their own tariffs against the United States in retaliation. Again, the question would be, but you know, how much of an impact would that have on the United States? And the same question would go for us. But if you listen to Minister Gwede Mantashe yesterday, he says, well, it is clear that the United States wants to make a run on minerals in the world, and we have minerals. So how much bargaining power, for lack of a better phrase, would we have in our negotiations with Donald Trump, should it get to that point where we have a bilateral sit down with him?
Well, the way, obviously, the obvious mineral that we have that is not prevalent in too many countries is platinum. But, you know, the demand for platinum has declined for automotive purposes in recent years because of the switch to electric vehicles. So that bargaining tool has diminished somewhat. The other thing is, if we don't export platinum to the U.S., we've got to find other markets to export it to. And I'm not sure that many other countries are already buying our platinum. So I think we would basically lose a lot of export revenue as a consequence of that. So it's, in a way, shooting oneself in the foot.
So as we round this up, because we are out of time, Dr. Makhubela, Dr. Jammine, just very quickly, your final word in terms of what Donald Trump is doing, the trajectory he is on, and especially us as South Africa, how do we respond to this? You know,
Sakina, we should move away from the notion that we are being targeted by Trump. Trump is not targeting us. He's looking at the interests of the U.S. So AGOA, if you listen to the rhetoric coming from Trump, AGOA is definitely gone, because the tax-free that gives us access to the U.S. market. And its basic principle is that it's a reciprocal arrangement. If you tax, he will tax. If you don't, he won't. So that AGOA, it's as good as done, as gone.
Dr. Jammine?
My concern is that I don't think that the full negative effects of the Trump policies have yet manifested themselves in their entirety. I think we're going to see a big the risk is that we see a big increase in inflation initially, that interest rates cannot come down as rapidly as one would have hoped, and that we also see, because of counter-retaliatory measures taken by other countries, and I'm afraid that this could be a catalyst for a downturn in the world economy, which would affect us negatively. I don't believe the Americans have fully grasped what Trump's policies, what the ramifications are, and we've seen a sharp downturn in equity prices in the last few days as the reality starts sinking in. And unless Trump retracts on some of these measures in due course, I think we could be in a lot of trouble.
Well, we have to leave it there, but thank you so much for your great insights this morning, Dr. Kingsley Makhubela, risk analyst and former diplomat, as well as Doctor Azar Jammine, director and chief economist at Econometrix, giving us their post-analysis of the United States President Donald Trump's speech that was delivered to the country's joint session of Congress in Washington, D.C. earlier this morning.